And welcome to this video tutorial. I hope you will find this information helpful as you continue in your studies. Good luck.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this lesson about Chapter 8 with building an application with multiple worksheets and workbooks. And I already discussed what the major objectives were for this chapter, so I thought I would demonstrate that. And here's an example of a workbook that is just for a family budget. Now this workbook here is a good example of a lot of the concepts you're going to be going through in Chapter 8. And I'll go in through another demonstration after just kind of showing you some of the things that are built in here. As you can see up here, I've put a macro button in there, a control. So you'll want to make sure you have your developer turned on here. If you don't see the developer tab, you'll need to go into the Backstage view. If I go to File, go to Options, we're going to go to Customizing. And you can see over here, the developer button is checked under my customizing the ribbon tab. So make sure that's checked. If not, you'll need to check that so you can work with the macros. And if I wanted to look at this macro, see what it does before I created one, I can go to that developer tab and I'm going to go into my macros. And I've got a couple workbooks open here, but this is the one we're looking at, Copy Month. I'm going to edit that, and here I can take a look at the Visual Basic work here. This is what makes up, this is all the programming that goes behind the scenes. Thankfully, we're not going to get into too much VBA here, but the VB here, the Visual Basic here, as we're doing things, as we're creating our macro and wherever we click and do something, that's being recorded back here, and Excel is translating that into the programming language for VB to be able to do the work for us whenever we want to run our macro. And you can see these where it's green here, these are called comments. These are actions that will not, the program will skip over. It's only looking for actual code. So it says here I'm starting a new macro and it's called Copy Month, and then here it skips over all this because this is just notes for us to be able to understand what it's doing. So it will then jump down here and go, okay, on the budgets worksheet, select, copy the information, put it before the lists worksheet, and you'll just, as you go through this, as you build your own, you can come back in and look and see what it does. But all it's really telling it to do is copy this worksheet and put it, that copy, before the list worksheet. So I know that in-depth VB is beyond this course, so I won't really go into it. But I just want to show you what it looks like, and you will get in here as well. Just to copy some code, move it around. But that's all you're going to do for this course with the VB. So if we go back in here, we'll see some of the other things that we've got. You can see we've got some hyperlinks going to other worksheets. And you can see as I hover over it, it says the hypertext is saying, oh, go to the list worksheet. Well, it's actually going to go to a specific cell. So if I click this, it takes me right here to cell A1, and I can see what the different types of information that are in my budget worksheet are listing. This is my list. So if I have another hyperlink here, I'm going to go back to budget, and you can see it brings me back here. And you can designate where you want your hyperlinks to go to, and which worksheet, which workbook, except things like that. We've also got some validation rules here on this worksheet. If I go to click a new entry here, you can see it's a validation rule saying date must be on or before January 1st, 2020. Well, where do we see that? Well, we are going to build those here on your work here in Chapter 8. So if we wanted to take a look at one of those as an example, we would go into our Data tab. We go over to our Data Tools group and Data Validation. Since this one has one in it, I'll click it. And you can see this is what it looks like. This one is set up for a date, and the date has to be greater than or equal to. That's the option that I've chosen, and then you put a date here. So if I wanted to change this, I would change this to 20, and I could hit OK. But my input message says, hey, the date must be on or before the January 1st, 20, and there's an error alert with the same thing. Hey, if you make a mistake, we're giving it some information saying, hey, this is what it needs to be done. So I hit OK. Now my validation rule is there. If I try to put a date, let's say 2-1- I don't know, 1998. Hit enter. It says nope, can't do that. So that's what a validation rule does. It makes sure that the data going in is the data you're looking for. If you ever hear the term in the IT world called GIGO, that's garbage in, garbage out, we're making sure we're not getting any garbage going in so that our useful information is not garbage going out. Here we've got another validation rule. It says that if it's an expense, so this is an actual working workbook here. If it's an expense, you're taking money away from your balance. If you're like an income, money that's going in, a deposit, that would be positive information, positive numbers. So that's why you see here that a paycheck is a value of 2,000, that's positive. This was entered as a negative 100, and that's why it's got the parentheses around it because of the way we've got the data set up. So that will take away whenever it sees information over here. So you can see we have a formula here. What is E6 plus the value that's in D7? Well, what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, we have a value plus whatever was in D7, which was a negative number, so that would be 1,000 minus 100, which is 900. And we see that this is a relative reference, so as it comes down here, you see that E7 and D8 are now the values. We're not using a absolute value. So it's now going to say, take this number plus this number, and that'll give you a new number. Another thing we've got here is we have a drop-down list, and you can see that we have a list of data that we can't put anything else in. It's a data validation. We know that these are the columns or categories from our list that we want to be inserted in here. If we scroll on down here, we'll see that we have our totals for the month. This is how much information is there, and this is where we see we have a formula built up, right? Well, there's another thing that we're doing here in our chapter 8 that's important here as well when it comes to our formulas. And that's seeing where our formulas are being used and where the information is coming from, how the data flows. And those are called precedents, and we'll take a look at those here in our formulas tab. Formula auditing group, because we're auditing our data. We want to see how our information flows. So that's our trace precedents. So what all affects our result? So if I click this, you'll see that we have arrows, and all the information is coming from this. Now there's actually, I don't like this because this should actually start here, not here. So we can fix those. We can take a look and we see that our formula starts with D5, where it really looks like it should be D7. So I'm just going to fix it right here. I'm going to delete, put a 7. Now if I scroll back up, now my data is coming here, and it's going to D35, which is where we ends right here. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. D7 through D35, and you can always edit your formulas too by hitting the F2 button on your keyboard and making sure your data is selected correctly, and we can see that that is correct. Before it was up here, that was just stupid because if someone would accidentally type in a number here, then that could affect my result, and that would be bad. So another thing that we've got here, if we're not looking at our precedents, is we can look at our dependents. I'm going to escape out of that. My trace dependents, there's nowhere else in this workbook where it's depending on the value that's here. So that's why I get this message here. So that I know that there's no place that I could affect a value for coming from this value. But that's how we could see. We would also have arrows and stuff that would point us to that as well. So you'll be using that as well. Another thing we're looking at is our workbook. If I go back here to File, I can see that this workbook is protected. So if I go to run my macro, which you can tell, another thing here is our workbook that I'm working with here is a macro enabled workbook based off its file extension .xlsm. So this is a .xlsx is what we're used to working with, or .xls, depending on which version of Office you're using. But with this M here, it means that it's macros enabled, and that's what we were looking at, up here with the control button that I created. And I didn't mention that, so I'll mention that now. If you're going to create a button, let's say I want to create a button that clears all this data, and because I have this button here that copies all this information, puts it into a new worksheet before the list worksheet, I would really actually put another macro here that would clear all of this data. And that way I'm working with new data every time I want to update this budget. So just wanted to throw that out there, and I would come up here to the controls group here on my developer tab, insert, and here are the different controls that you can put in here. This was just a button control, but you can put list controls, combo boxes. There's a lot of different controls that you can put up here. So we're not going to go real in depth in this, but I just want to make you aware of where that's at. So this is a protected workbook. Let's say I start a new month here, and I want to make this March. And let's put in some new data, and I'm just going to delete this. And let's say we had brought over our budget from the previous month, which was $2,900. You can see all of my formulas work themselves out. Saves us a lot of time. I'll put a date, and let's just say we're going to use March 1st. And we're going to say it was me. And we'll just say I had a grocery expense of $230. My formula is working. That makes sense. I had $2,900, but because I didn't pay attention to my expenses, I'm like, oh, wait a minute. I spent money on groceries. How did my running balance go up? That's because I didn't put a negative in here. So I go back in here. And now let's say I put another entry in. Let's say we'll put it in for $313 into the correct cell. It did not like that at all. There we go, $313. And let's see, my dog had an expense as well. It did not like me typing because of our validation rule. So we'll just select pets, and we'll say the dog had a vet bill of $120. And we'll put another entry for $318.20, where this is going to be some revenue, and let's say it's consulting business, and we'll say I made some money this week, and we'll say that consulting gig paid, $630. That's a positive, so we should see it go up, which it did. Now let's say I want to copy this March data, so I'm going to use my macro. You can say, hey, it says it's protected, you can't do this. Well, I'm not going to debug it. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. So I'm going to end this. I'm going to go back into my review tab, and I'm going to temporarily unprotect this. See how there's a gray box here? If I click this one more time, it will now be unprotected. I can check that in the backstage view. It says it's unprotected. I can unprotect that. Now I'm going to hit my copy monthly data, and you see it pops up here. I can name this to March. And more than likely you'd have one on, I would put one on here too, that probably after list, that gets all the totals from probably all the categories, so I know how much I'm spending each month with some pie charts, or just to see where all my money's going. So there's a lot you can do with this to make it relative to you and to your business. So if I want to go back in and protect this, I'm going to protect the workbook. I'm not going to put a password on this. Sometimes people leave organizations and then they can't, people don't know what the passwords were. and then this becomes a real problem. So I'm not gonna put a password on here, even though because it's just for demonstration, and I'm just protecting the structure of my workbook. Hit OK. If I go back in here to the Backstage view, you can see that once again this is protected. It's a weak protection, but it is some protection. And I think that's pretty much it for what I wanted to go for in presenting you some of the big concepts that you're going to not only read about but also work with in your lab. So I hope you found this information helpful. My next video will be over how to work through one of the labs, and we'll see how this comes into play in an actual assignment. I just wanted to give you a real quick example. Thank you, everyone. Let's have a great week.